When people imagine the Middle Ages, they usually picture a world of stone fortresses, armored warriors, solemn cathedrals, and crowded marketplaces. Yet behind those familiar images existed another, far more personal world that is rarely described in history books, a world made up of everyday emotions, private relationships, and quiet moments that shaped the real lives of ordinary men and women. We tend to think of medieval society as distant and strange, almost like a different planet with different kinds of people. But the truth is that beneath the unfamiliar clothing, customs, and beliefs lived human beings who felt loneliness, affection, jealousy, hope, and desire in ways that would be immediately recognizable to anyone alive today. To understand what intimate life was truly like in that era, we must first accept that their entire way of thinking about relationships was built on foundations very different from our own. Foundations shaped by religion, social hierarchy, family duty, and economic necessity, rather than by modern ideas of individual choice and personal fulfillment. In the 21st century, we often assume that relationships are primarily about emotional connection and personal happiness. But in medieval Europe, intimacy was rarely viewed as a purely private matter, because a person's life was deeply embedded within a network of family expectations, community traditions, and religious teachings that guided almost every important decision. Marriage, which formed the central structure of most intimate relationships, was not usually seen as a romantic union between two individuals, but rather as a practical partnership designed to create stability, raise children, manage property, and ensure the survival of the household in a world where daily life was often unpredictable and difficult. Among kings, nobles, and wealthy families, marriage was treated almost like a diplomatic agreement, carefully negotiated to secure alliances, protect land, or improve political influence. And in such cases, the personal feelings of the young couple were considered far less important than the strategic benefits that the union could bring. It was not unusual for aristocratic children to be promised in marriage when they were still very young, sometimes even before they could speak, with formal contracts signed by parents who saw marriage as a tool for strengthening family power rather than as a matter of personal affection. The idea that a young man or woman might simply choose a partner based on love would have seemed dangerously unpredictable to many medieval parents, especially in a society where a single poor match could weaken a family's position for generations. For peasants, craftsmen, and townspeople, the rules were somewhat more flexible, because ordinary people usually had more freedom to choose their spouses. Yet, even among them, practical concerns such as property, reputation, and the approval of relatives played a far greater role than anything we would call romance. A good marriage was expected to be a working partnership in which both partners contributed to the survival of the household, whether through farming, running a shop, caring for animals, or raising children. And love, while welcome, was often seen as something that grew gradually over time rather than as the starting point of a relationship. Courtship certainly existed, but it looked very different from modern dating, because young people rarely had the opportunity to meet privately, and most social interaction took place in public settings, such as church services, religious festivals, seasonal fairs, or communal gatherings, where the eyes of neighbors and relatives were always watching. Privacy, as we understand it today, was almost unknown in most medieval homes. Since families often lived in small houses with only one or two rooms, and even in castles or large manor houses, servants, guests, and extended relatives were constantly present, making truly secluded moments extremely rare. This lack of privacy shaped the way people thought about intimacy, because relationships were lived openly within the community rather than hidden behind closed doors. And medieval society generally treated marriage and physical closeness as natural parts of everyday life, rather than as secret or shameful subjects. Religion influenced every aspect of medieval existence, and intimate life was no exception, since the church taught that physical relationships were morally acceptable primarily within marriage, and ideally for the purpose of creating children who would continue the Christian community. Priests and theologians wrote long and detailed texts about proper behavior between husbands and wives, offering guidance on everything from emotional loyalty to daily conduct. And although these writings were strict, they show that medieval society was far more willing to discuss intimate matters than many modern people assume. At the same time, ordinary men and women often found themselves struggling to balance official religious expectations with the complicated realities of human emotion, because feelings of attraction, jealousy, and longing did not disappear simply because sermons warned against them. Medieval literature is filled with stories, poems, and songs that explore the intensity of love and desire, proving that people of the time were deeply familiar with the same emotional experiences that shape relationships today, even if they expressed those experiences in a more formal or poetic language. One of the most intriguing features of medieval culture was the tradition known as courtly love, especially popular among the nobility, which celebrated the idea of passionate devotion between a knight and a noble lady, often outside the boundaries of marriage. In the ideal world of courtly love, a knight might dedicate himself entirely to the honor of a woman he admired, writing verses in her praise, wearing her colors in tournaments, and performing acts of bravery in her name, creating a romantic ideal that influenced European art and literature for centuries. These relationships were usually meant to remain symbolic rather than physical, emphasizing loyalty, admiration, and emotional intensity rather than practical partnership, and they coexisted in an interesting tension with the far more pragmatic reality of arranged marriages. For most ordinary people, however, intimate life revolved less around poetry and more around the daily necessities of work and survival, because maintaining a household required constant cooperation and shared responsibility between husband and wife. Men and women labored side by side in fields, workshops, kitchens, and marketplaces, and the success of a family depended on their ability to function as a team, which meant that emotional bonds were often built slowly through years of shared effort rather than through sudden romantic passion. Hygiene and physical appearance, which play such an important role in modern ideas of attraction, were understood differently in the Middle Ages, though not as poorly as popular myths suggest, since many towns had public bathhouses, and people took pride in presenting themselves as clean and respectable. Contrary to the stereotype that medieval people never washed, bathing was a common social activity in many regions, and both men and women cared about grooming, pleasant scents, and tidy clothing, especially when hoping to make a good impression on a potential partner. Clothing was one of the main ways individuals expressed beauty and status, and even those with limited resources tried to dress as neatly and attractively as possible, because appearance played a significant role in courtship and social reputation. Medieval writers often praised qualities such as clear skin, bright eyes, graceful manners, and modest behavior, showing that ideals of beauty were connected not only to physical traits, but also to moral character and personal virtue. Women were generally expected to embody gentleness, loyalty, and modesty, while men were admired for strength, courage, generosity, and the ability to provide for their families. And these expectations shaped how people evaluated potential spouses. Children usually arrived soon after marriage, partly because reliable methods of family planning were limited, and partly because high infant mortality made large families a practical necessity for the survival of a household. Raising children was considered one of the central purposes of adult life, and intimate relationships were therefore closely connected to broader responsibilities toward family, faith, and community, rather than focus solely on personal happiness, because medical knowledge was limited and life expectancy shorter than today. Many marriages were interrupted by illness or death, making widowhood a common experience and remarriage a socially accepted and often encouraged necessity. Medieval communities were pragmatic about such matters, understanding that a household needed two adults to function effectively, and emotional companionship was valued, even if it was rarely spoken about in openly sentimental terms. Letters and personal writings that have survived from the period reveal that husbands and wives often developed genuine affection for one another over time, expressing gratitude, concern, and tenderness in ways that feel surprisingly modern to us now. Not all marriages, of course, were peaceful or happy, and medieval court records contain many examples of bitter disputes, legal separations, and family conflicts, reminding us that human relationships in every age can be complicated, fragile, and sometimes painful. Although the law generally favored men and placed husbands in a position of formal authority, women were far from powerless figures, and many medieval wives managed household finances, supervised servants, organized business affairs, and made crucial decisions that affected the survival of their families. In towns and cities especially, women could be found running workshops, keeping accounts, selling goods in markets, and taking part in the economic life of their communities, which meant that intimate partnerships were often based on a practical equality that modern stereotypes of the Middle Ages tend to ignore. Friendship formed another important layer of intimate life, since emotional support did not come only from marriage, but also from close bonds with relatives, neighbors, and companions who shared the burdens and joys of daily existence. Medieval letters between friends are filled with warmth, humor, and affection, proving that people of the time valued emotional connection just as deeply as we do, even if they expressed it in more formal language than we are used to today. Humor about relationships was widespread, and medieval songs, poems, and stories often made gentle fun of jealous husbands, quarrelsome wives, nervous young lovers, and the everyday misunderstandings that arise whenever people try to live together. These jokes and tales show that medieval people were perfectly aware of the difficulties of intimate life and were able to laugh at their own weaknesses, which makes them feel surprisingly close to us across the centuries. Another aspect of medieval intimacy that is often misunderstood is the role of emotion within arranged marriages, because although many unions began for practical reasons, that did not mean that affection could not grow naturally over time. Shared labor, mutual reliance, and the raising of children together frequently created strong emotional bonds. And there are many historical examples of husbands and wives who clearly cared deeply for one another after years of living side by side. Travelers from later centuries who looked back at medieval marriages sometimes assumed that they were cold and loveless, but personal documents from the period tell a far more complex and human story. The daily rhythm of medieval life shaped intimacy in ways that modern people might find both challenging and comforting, because relationships were not isolated from the rest of life, but woven directly into work, faith, and community. A husband and wife might spend their entire day together, working the same fields, tending the same animals, preparing food, repairing tools, and caring for children, which meant that emotional closeness often developed through constant shared experience. At the same time, the heavy demands of survival left little room for the kind of leisure and personal exploration that modern couples often enjoy, and intimate life was therefore deeply connected to responsibility and duty. Festivals and religious holidays provided rare opportunities for relaxation and celebration, and these occasions were important moments for courtship, flirtation, and the strengthening of social bonds within communities. Music, dancing, and storytelling allowed young people to meet one another in relatively relaxed settings, though always under the watchful gaze of families and neighbors who took a strong interest in maintaining proper behavior. Because the church played such a central role in medieval society, many intimate relationships were shaped by spiritual concerns, and couples were encouraged to see their union not only as a personal bond, but as a moral and religious commitment. Marriage vows were taken extremely seriously, and breaking them was considered not just a personal failure, but a sin that could endanger the soul, which gave intimate life a spiritual weight that is difficult for many modern people to imagine. Confession and pastoral guidance meant that priests were often involved in the private concerns of their parishioners, offering advice about marital difficulties, family conflicts, and moral dilemmas. This close connection between religion and daily life created a culture in which people constantly tried to balance personal feelings with spiritual duties, sometimes succeeding gracefully and sometimes struggling painfully. Attitudes toward physical beauty and attraction were influenced not only by fashion, but also by moral teaching, since vanity was often criticized, while modesty and inner virtue were praised as the highest forms of attractiveness. Nevertheless, medieval art and literature clearly show that people appreciated physical beauty just as much as we do, and poets wrote admiringly about graceful figures, shining hair, and expressive eyes with a sensitivity that feels very modern. Romantic longing was a common theme in medieval songs, and wandering musicians known as troubadours traveled from court to court, performing ballads about love, heartbreak, and devotion that captured the imagination of audiences across Europe. These cultural expressions remind us that even in a society dominated by strict rules and religious discipline, the human heart continued to seek excitement, passion, and emotional fulfillment. Medical knowledge about the human body was limited, and many aspects of intimate life were surrounded by superstition, folklore, and misunderstanding. Yet people still developed their own practical wisdom based on experience. Midwives, healers, and older relatives often served as sources of advice for young couples, passing down generations of informal knowledge about relationships, family life, and emotional well-being. Pregnancy and childbirth were central events in medieval intimate life, filled with both hope and fear, since the risks were high and medical help limited, and communities rallied together to support mothers and newborn children. The arrival of a child strengthened the bond between spouses and tied them even more closely to the wider network of family and neighbors who helped care for the next generation. Because life was uncertain and death an ever-present reality, expressions of affection were often practical rather than sentimental, taking the form of loyalty, protection, and daily acts of care. In times of illness or hardship, husbands and wives relied on one another for comfort and survival. And these shared struggles frequently deepened emotional connections in ways that modern observers sometimes underestimate. The concept of personal privacy slowly began to change toward the end of the medieval period, as houses became larger and social structures more complex. But for most of the Middle Ages, intimacy remained a visible and accepted part of communal life. Travelers from other cultures who visited Europe sometimes commented on how openly medieval people spoke about matters that later centuries would consider delicate, showing that attitudes toward intimacy have shifted dramatically over time. Despite the many restrictions and expectations placed upon them, medieval men and women found countless small ways to express tenderness, whether through letters, gifts, shared meals, or simple gestures of everyday kindness. Even arranged marriages could contain genuine warmth, and some of the most moving medieval documents are the wills and final letters in which spouses expressed deep gratitude for a lifetime of companionship. When we step back and look at the broader picture, it becomes clear that medieval intimate life was not defined by a single pattern, but by a rich variety of experiences, shaped by class, region, religion, and personal character. A peasant couple in a rural village, a merchant family in a bustling town, and a noble pair in a royal court all lived very different versions of medieval intimacy. Yet all of them navigated the same basic human questions about love, loyalty, and belonging. As Europe slowly changed in the centuries that followed, new ideas about romance and individual choice began to emerge, but the emotional foundations laid in the Middle Ages continued to influence Western culture long after castles had fallen into ruin. Even today, many of our traditions surrounding weddings, family life, and expressions of love have roots that reach back into that distant era, reminding us that the past is never truly separate from the present. When we read the personal writings that survive from medieval times, we encounter people who worried about finding suitable partners, felt shy before speaking to someone they admired, argued with their spouses, and rejoiced at the birth of their children. They experienced excitement on wedding days, anxiety during separations, and grief when loved ones died, emotions that cross the boundaries of time and make them feel surprisingly close to us. Their world lacked modern comforts and freedoms, yet within its limits they created relationships filled with meaning, humor, tenderness, and resilience. Perhaps the most important thing to remember is that medieval people were not simply figures in armor or characters in illuminated manuscripts, but real human beings who sought the same basic things that we seek today: companionship, understanding, stability, and affection. History often portrays the Middle Ages as a dark and distant time, but when we explore the intimate lives of the people who lived then, we discover a world that is far more familiar than we might expect. Behind the grand cathedrals and ancient walls lived countless ordinary couples who cared for one another, argued, made up, raised families, and grew old together, leaving behind traces of their emotions in letters, poems, and stories. In the quiet spaces of medieval homes, away from battles and politics, people held hands, whispered comforting words, celebrated small joys, and mourned private losses, just as we do now. Understanding this human side of the past helps us see that the Middle Ages were not merely an age of hardship and superstition, but also an age of deep emotional life, rich with experiences that continue to connect us to those who lived so long ago. And when we imagine intimate life in that era, we should picture not only strict rules and heavy traditions, but also the warmth of shared firesides, the laughter of families gathered together, and the enduring human desire to be close to someone who understands us. In the end, exploring how people loved and lived in the Middle Ages reminds us of a simple but powerful truth. Although centuries may separate us from them, the fundamental nature of human emotion has changed far less than we often assume. Their world was harder and more uncertain than ours, yet within it they built relationships that gave their lives meaning, comfort, and joy, proving that intimacy is not a modern invention, but a timeless part of what it means to be human. And perhaps that realization allows us to look back across the long centuries with greater empathy, seeing medieval men and women not as distant strangers, but as people very much like ourselves, searching in their own way for connection, love, and a place to belong.